forest echoed with shouts and flickering lights. Lucas ran from them, driven by sheer terror into the pitch-black night, deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. Pine branches clawed at his face, dry needles scraped his skin, and twigs snapped beneath his boots. Still, the pursuers kept close. Their grudge against the townsfolk was sharp as their teeth. Lucas zigzagged, froze to listen, but the voices always found him, forcing him to flee again, like a frantic rabbit through the thick, tangled pines. A stray root caught his foot, yanking him down like the skeletal hand of a corpse. He fell face first into the needle-covered ground. The torchlight flickered through the trees, already blinding his exhausted eyes. Lucas tried to get up, but collapsed again. Pain lanced through his ankle, radiating up his leg like fire. He barely managed to swallow his groan. So this is it, he thought bitterly, bracing himself for death. But just then, a bush ahead shuddered, and a man emerged, as massive as a bear. Lucas didn't recognize him, a stranger, which was odd since Lucas knew every face in his small town. A scavenger, perhaps. Someone hoping to snatch up a fugitive and turn him in for a reward. If so, they'd be sorely disappointed. No one would pay so much as a penny for Lucas's sorry hide. But the man seemed to have another agenda entirely. Without a word, he grabbed Lucas, slung him over his broad shoulder like a sack of grain, and set off, heading away from the deadly torches. "Stop! You won't get away," a voice called out, followed by the sharp whistle of an arrow cutting through the air. The stranger growled, a deep, feral sound, cursing whoever was shooting at him with such unerring aim, but he didn't slow. He tore through the forest with the speed of a man possessed. Dangling upside down, Lucas couldn't see where they were going, but a flicker of hope warmed his heart. Perhaps this stranger wasn't an enemy but a savior. Soon, they burst out onto a riverbank, heading straight for a shallow crossing. This man knows the land, Lucas realized. He must have been looking for me. Once they reached the far side of the river, the shouts began to fade, and the flickering lights disappeared entirely. The townsfolk wouldn't come this far, too frightened of the beast that had mutilated the mayor's daughter. But the stranger either didn't know about the monster or didn't fear it. He finally set Lucas down on a mossy boulder, leaning against it himself to catch his breath. Lucas studied him carefully. Wild-haired, broad-shouldered, with a face set in a grim scowl. Sweat streaked his features, and his hand clutched his side, dark blood seeping between his fingers. The moon peeked out from behind a cloud, and its pale light revealed the wound. An arrow had sunk deep into his flesh, the blood soaking his shirt. It was a dire injury, but strangely it filled Lucas with determination rather than dread. "Let me help," Lucas offered, though he would have examined the wound without permission if necessary. The stranger nodded, clenching his teeth against the pain. As for Lucas, something shifted in him at the sight of blood. His ears roared, his breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest as if he'd plunged into icy water. The only thing he'd managed to keep during his flight was his satchel of tools and vials. He yanked it open so forcefully he nearly tore off the button, spilling its contents onto the ground. Bottles of tinctures, honed instruments, and clean cloths. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The pain in his ankle was forgotten as if it had never existed. Time seemed to stand still. Lucas didn't notice the blood covering his arms up to the elbows, or the cold sweat drenching his brow. He remembered only this. The stranger barely moved, growling occasionally but otherwise as still and solid as a stone. When Lucas finished, the man gave him a look that could only be described as grateful. "Well, they weren't wrong," he rumbled. "Word is there's no better healer in these parts." Lucas allowed himself a weary smile. He felt drained and hollowed out, but it was a satisfying emptiness, one that demanded nothing of him. He packed his tools back into his bag, and time began to flow again, filled with the murmur of the rushing river and the calls of distant birds. The man gingerly touched the bandage on his side, then rose slowly, extending a calloused hand. Lucas's thin, trembling fingers looked like a child's in comparison. "Looks like we're even," the man remarked grimly. "That's bad." "Bad?" Lucas asked, puzzled. "Bad that I've got no excuse to force you to come with me." Lucas straightened, testing his injured ankle. He could stand on it, though it throbbed sharply. It would hold, for now. But where would he go? His house had been burned to the ground, and if he dared show his face in town, he'd be hanged without a trial. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his curiosity plain. "Your skill." "Who's sick?" "Someone is," the man admitted. "We've tried everything else. You're our last hope." Lucas didn't hesitate long. One road led to a pitchfork, the other to the unknown. Not much of a choice. "What's your name?" Lucas asked. "Conrad," the man replied. "Well then, Conrad," Lucas said, slinging his satchel over his shoulder. "Lead the way." They trudged along a narrow path littered with fallen branches, the dense canopy above blocking out any hint of light. Conrad's breathing was labored, wheezing, and his steps grew heavier with each passing minute. Though the arrow had miraculously missed his heart, the blood loss had been severe, and even now it seeped through the bandage. "How far?" Lucas asked, knowing full well he wouldn't be able to carry the massive man, especially with his own bad ankle. "Not far now," Conrad muttered. Just past the clearing, Lucas hesitated. In the dim, shifting light, he thought he saw something move, something not human. It slinked between the pines, its paws silent on the carpet of needles. Suddenly, it froze, listening. Lucas didn't move a muscle. Would it leave? The rumors said the creature only hunted young maidens, leaving others alone unless provoked. "Wait," Lucas whispered to Conrad. "Do you see it?" The beast darted between the trees, a fleeting shadow, its eyes flashing silver in the moonlight. Over there, the man rasped. The clearing. Beyond the clearing lay a small village, the kind you could count the houses on your fingers. In the dim light of dawn, roosters crowed their morning songs. Sensing the presence of a stranger, the guard dogs erupted into a cacophony of furious barking, their chains straining to hold them back. Conrad was barely holding himself together, but managed to lead Lucas to a large cabin with red-trimmed windows. He banged his fist against the door and bellowed, "Open up, Reynard. I've brought a savior for Zlata." The door flew open, revealing a man dressed only in his underclothes. His unkempt curly beard framed a gaunt face, and the flame of the candle in his hand illuminated deep-set eyes, dark and swamp-like, cold and severe. This was a man who had seen his share of grief, the kind that poisons the blood. But there was still steel in him, keeping him upright. "Are you serious?" the man asked, incredulously scanning Lucas from head to toe. "Is he really a healer?" Lucas shrugged. "Not exactly. I never passed the Apothecaries Guild exam, and I doubt I'd succeed even if I tried." "Still," Reynard pressed, "you practiced medicine in your town until recently." "I did," Lucas admitted. Reynard extended a thin, almost insubstantial hand and introduced himself. "Reynard, the village elder. And you must be Lucas? They say you studied under Perisvet, the herbalist." "For a short while," Lucas replied. "Why only a short while?" Reynard's gaze sharpened. Lucas stayed silent. He hadn't prepared a lie for this occasion, and deception had never been his strength. Besides, It was clear Reynard already knew why the apprentice and master had parted ways. Was it jealousy that got the better of him? Reynard pressed, confirming Lucas's suspicions. Not jealousy, Lucas said reluctantly. Cowardice. Well then, Reynard said, clapping Lucas on the shoulder, I'll give you shelter and won't ask what drove you from your town. But on one condition. You'll do everything in your power to free my daughter from death's grip. What affliction has befallen her? Lucas asked. Come and see for yourself. First, we need to tend to Conrad. Lucas hesitated, glancing at his pale rescuer. He's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest and a brew to ease the pain. Reynard shot Lucas a disapproving look, then turned his glare on Conrad. It was obvious he cared little for the injured man when his own daughter was at death's door. But something in Lucas's tone convinced him. Arguing would take too long, and too much time had already been wasted. Fine, Reynard relented. Yet Lucas understood that Reynard only considered one word as truth, his own. Still, he allowed Lucas to escort Conrad to a cabin across the way, where they laid him down and gave him a dose of a healing tincture. Conrad's eyes rolled back, but he clutched Lucas's hand, whispering desperately, Don't waste time on me. Go to Zlata. She needs you more. I'll pull through. Born strong, I am. Won't let a little wound get the best of me. Lucas had no choice but to leave, though curiosity gnawed at him. Would the new remedy work? Would it quickly dull the pain and halt the infection? But Reynard stood like a dark shadow at his back, and Lucas couldn't afford to delay any longer. Together they returned to the elder's cabin. Against the far wall, on a makeshift cot, lay a young woman, trembling so violently her heels drummed against the wood. At her side, a stout woman knelt, dabbing the girl's fevered forehead with a cloth. Once again, Lucas felt that familiar hunger, that inner tremor of anticipation. Neither the heavy, briny smell of illness filling the air nor the sight of a body writhing in agony disturbed him. Instead, he felt an itch deep within, a restless need to soothe it by confronting the problem head-on. He quickly approached the girl and sat on the edge of the cot. Her eyes had rolled back, her breathing was shallow and labored, with a bubbling wheeze rattling in her chest. Her forehead burned like a stoked furnace, and sweat trickled down her temples, soaking the pillow beneath her head in dark, damp patches. "How long has she been like this?" Lucas asked the woman tending to her. 3 days now," the woman said, her voice trembling. "She doesn't eat, she doesn't drink, she doesn't answer to her name. We weren't sure you'd make it in time." Lucas sighed heavily. Conrad knew why Lucas had been driven from his town. He must have known. Knew and yet still sought him out. Not because of Lucas's reputation, but because there was no other choice. Did he want the girl to die, knowing the truth about Lucas? No, Lucas realized. He doesn't. He simply has no alternative. "She went to the raspberry thicket," the nursemaid murmured, wringing her hands, and came back her dress red as blood, though she'd gone out in blue. "Please, check her leg." Lucas, aware of Reynard's piercing gaze from where he stood silent and unmoving in the doorway, carefully pulled up the girl's shift. Beneath it was a crude bandage, dark with dried blood. The moment his fingers touched her leg, the girl thrashed violently, clutching the sheet with bloodless fingers and moaning in pain. "Easy, easy," Lucas murmured, gently removing the cloth, soaked through with crimson. The jagged arc of a bite wound had already begun to scab over, but was still raw and vivid on her skin. Lucas wiped the sweat from his brow and sank heavily onto the edge of the cot. "Why, you savage beast," he thought grimly. "Why do you prey on maidens? Are you searching for a wolf among the daughters of men? You'll claim no more victims, not if I have any say in it, over my dead body. Well? Reynard's voice broke the silence. His keen eyes hadn't left Lucas. Can you save her or not? Lucas started, his hand still resting on the girl's limp arm. I'll help, Lucas said with a nod. Bring me my satchel. When the work was done, Lucas gestured for Reynard to follow him outside into the entryway. Wiping sweat from his brow, he asked, Who else knows about her illness? Just about the whole village, Reynard admitted. When she came back from the forest covered in blood, she scared the old women half to death, turned their hair gray on the spot. I see, Lucas interrupted. Well, she'll feel better now, but I'll have to start again tomorrow. One question, though. Ask it. If you know why I was driven out of my town, why bring me to your daughter? Surely you didn't think anyone else could handle it? You're the only one in the region who knows this illness, Reynard replied, spreading his hands. If you can't help her, no one can. It's not like we have anything left to lose. Without you, her path is clear. Here's the thing, Lucas said. In 2 days, bring me a boar. I'll try a new treatment, but if it doesn't work, don't hold it against me. I'll do everything I can, but I'm not the Almighty. Fortunately, Reynard didn't press further and hurried off to the hunters. Lucas stepped out of the cabin into the clear midday sun and, to his surprise, found Conrad sitting stubbornly on a bench by the porch. He looked terrible but unyielding. If you want to recover, you need to rest, Lucas chided, sitting down beside him. There'll be no rest for me until I know if there's hope for Zlata, Conrad replied. There's only hope, Lucas admitted. Listen, Conrad said, his voice firm. If you save Zlata, you'll be seated next to me at the wedding feast as my sworn brother. She's your betrothed? Lucas asked, without much interest. Reynard gave his blessing just a week ago, Conrad said with a hint of pride before his expression darkened. But 2 days later she went into the raspberry thicket, though I begged her not to. Everyone knows what lurks there, but she slipped away from me. When she came back, I nearly lost my mind. Reynard doesn't blame me, not outright, but you can see it in his eyes. He regrets his permission and doesn't want the wedding anymore. Not that it matters to me now. Just tell me, what will become of her? I'll use every skill I have for her sake, Lucas promised. But you know how it ended in my town. And if you fail, Conrad hesitated. Could she find refuge in the forest? Lucas stayed silent. One beast in the forest was bad enough. But that's how the beasts work. Draw in a mate, and soon there are pups. One beast is trouble. A pack is insurmountable. Is it true? Conrad asked suddenly, breaking Lucas's thoughts, that your master was so enraged by your skill that he took his own life out of pride? Nonsense, Lucas said with a shrug. There was no pride in him, only fear. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to change and wash my hands. Come, Conrad said, rising with difficulty. I'll show you where. His face betrayed the lingering fear that Lucas might refuse to treat his bride. Lucas was given lodging in a cabin at the edge of the village. Its owners, an elderly couple, were both deaf and shouted at each other so loudly the walls seemed to shake. Still, Lucas didn't complain. It was better than wandering the woods. Conrad even arranged for water to be heated so Lucas could wash his hands and face. Before bed, Lucas took a powder from his satchel, rubbed it into his gums, and slept the sleep of the righteous. The next morning, he returned to Zlata. The room was brighter now, and he could see her clearly. He almost wished the sun had stayed hidden. Lucas had seen beautiful women before, but Zlata resembled them as a delicate lace shawl resembles an iron gate. What struck him most were her long, graceful fingers with pale pink nails, and her lips, pale but alluring, pressed softly together like a folded leaf. No wonder Conrad cared for her so deeply. If they were destined to have children, each would surely be a marvel. Suddenly her closed eyelids fluttered, and she opened her speckled hazel eyes. Seeing a stranger, she asked fearfully, "Who are you?" "Don't be afraid," Lucas said quickly, trying to calm her. "I'm a healer. Your father and fiancé brought me here to help you." "And what is your name?" she asked. "Lucas." He touched her forehead and gave her a medicinal brew to drink. Her condition had improved noticeably since the previous night, a sign that worried him. It meant the illness had taken hold of her body, and her spirit had stopped fighting it. "I'll do my best to cure you," Lucas said. "Thank you," she murmured, though her voice carried a quiet despair. "But I know there's no cure. I've seen the beast. I know what I'll become." "I've treated someone with your illness before," Lucas replied, "and I know a thing or two about it. There's a way. It'll be hard, but if you can find the strength." "And what happened to that person?" Zlata interrupted, her voice trembling with urgency. "Did they recover?" Lucas hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to lie. "No," he admitted. "They died, but it'll be different with you. I didn't fully understand the treatment back then, but now I know where I went wrong." They fell silent. Lucas gazed at the sick girl, his heart tightening with unease, his stomach churning with fear. He was terrified of failing her, of destroying a soul so young, tender, and defenseless. A soul housed in a body that stirred a warmth in him he dared not acknowledge. "You have a pure heart," Zlata said softly, her voice carrying an earnestness that pierced him. "I can see it in your eyes. Take my fate into your hands and do with it as you will. I'll trust any word you speak, follow any command you give." She truly is golden, Lucas thought, and in that moment, he knew he was lost. The next day, Zlata rose from her bed and stepped outside. Lucas watched her with quiet despair. He alone knew the sickness hadn't left her. Yet the villagers rejoiced. Conrad's bride was healthy and whole. The healer had succeeded. The wedding was soon to follow. Stealing a moment, Lucas approached Reynard and whispered urgently in his ear, "Lock the doors to her room at night." "But she's cured," Reynard protested hotly. "You cured her?" "No," Lucas said firmly. "She isn't cured, but she will be, if you follow my instructions." "Mind your own work," Reynard replied, clapping a heavy hand on Lucas's shoulder. "And I'll mind mine." Lucas watched him walk away, realizing there was no convincing the elder. No argument, no plea would sway him. But by the afternoon, two events brought Lucas a measure of solace. First, Conrad arrived to inform him that they'd captured a boar for his treatment, though he couldn't fathom why it was still needed now that Zlata was supposedly well. Lucas assured him it was necessary and instructed him to bring the boar to the shed behind the elderly couple's house. It needed to be secured and the space prepared for his work, with a place to sit and a surface for writing. "What, you planning to sleep with it?" Conrad joked. "Watch yourself. It's wild, stubborn, and strong. Wouldn't want it skewering you on those tusks, scrawny as you are." "I'll manage," Lucas replied, convincing him with quiet resolve. Shortly after Conrad left, before the boar arrived, Zlata herself appeared. She wore an embroidered dress, her gaze sweeping over the humble room. She crossed herself before the icons in the red corner and sat at the table across from Lucas. "They say the illness has left me," she began, her voice calm but troubled. "But I don't feel right. Something's wrong." "The treatment isn't finished," Lucas replied. "Tomorrow I'll bring you another remedy." "You said the other one, the man—" "He passed," Zlata said, her eyes downcast, her fingers twisting together nervously. "Tell me, did he suffer much before the end?" A shudder ran through Lucas. "No," he said quietly. "I eased his pain." She nodded, a small, resigned motion. Then she stood and stepped closer to Lucas, dangerously close. "How much time do I have left as myself, if your remedy doesn't work?" she asked, her gaze piercing him, as though seeing straight into the most broken parts of his soul. "No one can say," he replied, inhaling deeply, the dry air tasting faintly of pine. "Then listen," she said, her long fingers gripping his limp hand firmly. "I didn't want to marry Conrad. My father arranged it. Conrad isn't a bad man, but I don't love him. If I were healthy, I might have lived with him, loveless, to the end of my days. But if death looms behind me, I won't pretend any more." Lucas waited for her to continue, but her lips pressed into a stubborn line, her eyes glistening. A terrible chill seized him, his mind clouding as though he had been struck with fever himself. His fingers slackened in her grasp. Zlata slipped from the room, quietly closing the door behind her. Lucas sat trembling for a long while, his heart pounding erratically. At last, he rubbed powder into his gums from a small vial, calming himself. His thoughts wandered to the elder's daughter in his old town, the one who had suffered from the same illness as Zlata. Had she suffered before she died? If she had, her mind was too far gone to know it. When her white fur sprouted and her sharp teeth emerged, Lucas had taken up his knife. The next morning, the elder had found his daughter in her bed, her throat slit. There had been no fur or fangs to justify Lucas's actions. No proof, only the sight of an innocent girl murdered. The town had grabbed their pitchforks and driven him into the woods like a rabid animal. As he'd fled, only one thought hammered in his head. Why didn't the cure work? What did I do wrong? If not for Conrad, he would have perished in the forest. Now, by some miracle of God's mercy, Lucas had been given a second chance. This time he would do everything right. He would save Zlata. In the shed behind the house, Lucas laid out his tools on a wooden block. Empty vials, clean cloths, a bottle of moonshine, a folded sheet of paper, an inkwell and pen, a tourniquet, roasted beef kidneys, and, his crown jewel for the night ahead, a thick, blunt-needled apothecary syringe. The syringe had been stolen from Peresvet the herbalist, an act that had earned Lucas his master's undying hatred. But he had never returned the stolen tool. In the corner, the boar lay on its side, its legs bound. It was a monstrous creature, bristling, blood-streaked tusks flanking its gray snout. Lucas stared at the beast with quiet sorrow. What if it doesn't work again? What if I've made another mistake? What if it gets even worse? And why had Zlata come to him? Why had she said what she did? To inspire him, to drive him to greater effort. Who could say what a person might do to save their soul? And Lucas himself, why had he agreed to this risky endeavor? He glanced at the boar again. Because of her? Because I can't keep my hands from trembling when I see her? Or is it for the sake of discovery? Peresvet had once told him, a healer cannot be worthy until he makes a sacrifice. Perhaps Lucas's time had come. He picked up the syringe and looked at the boar. The beast had grown eerily still, as if sensing the dread that hung in the air. Well then, Lucas thought, the familiar spark of curiosity surging to smother his fear. Let's see what fate has in store. He drew the paper toward him, dipped his pen into the inkwell, and began to write. I am beginning a new treatment involving the infusion of boar's blood into a woman of 20 years, lacking other viable options. I am fully aware of the risks involved, but have determined that a change in approach is necessary. 2 hours later, as Lucas left the shed to visit Zlata. A stray draft swept the note from the workbench. A slanted ray of dawn illuminated its reverse side, revealing an excerpt written in the same steady, deliberate hand. I proposed to my master, Perisvet the herbalist, that he allow me to attempt a cure for the illness, given the absence of other healers. He refused. Were I given permission, I would have called for an incision of the abdomen and removal of the kidney, as it is well known to be the source of incurable blood corruption. My master grew angry, accusing me of malicious intent. There was none, only the intent to heal. If I cannot sway Perisvet, he will live but a week longer, dying in agony due to his cowardice. At first light, Lucas knocked on Zlata's door. The floorboards creaked faintly, and the door opened to reveal her trembling form, clad in a nightgown that fell to her ankles. Her eyes darted fearfully, her hands hidden behind her back as though she were ashamed to show them. Yet she stepped aside, letting Lucas enter and set his satchel and vials on the small table in the corner. "Sit down," Lucas instructed, pointing to the bench as he turned to lock the door. Zlata stared at him in silence but obeyed. It wasn't until Lucas began unpacking his instruments that she asked, glancing nervously at the vials, "Whose blood is that?" "Boar's," he replied, suppressing a grimace. As Zlata's wide eyes remained fixed on the vials, Lucas worked quickly, preparing the syringe, a strip of cloth, and a bottle of moonshine. He exhaled slowly and gave himself a small nod before approaching her. "How will this help?" Zlata asked, her voice trembling. "It will dilute the illness," Lucas explained. "We'll draw some of your blood and replace it with the boar's. 3 treatments should suffice." Zlata stared at him in shock. Even with no knowledge of medicine, she could see he was conducting an experiment with little chance of success. What she didn't know was that her blood, already altered by the illness, was no longer fully human. This gave Lucas a glimmer of hope that her body might adapt to the infusion. "I have faith in you, like in the Lord himself," Zlata confessed suddenly, as Lucas sat beside her and tied a tourniquet around her slender arm. "Don't," he said sharply, irritation creeping into his tone. Lucas worked methodically, taking his time. Zlata winced, her smooth brow furrowing as she wiped away tears, likely from fear rather than pain. Still, her gaze remained fixed on Lucas, and more than once her head leaned against his shoulder. Lucas allowed it, though it stirred a gnawing ache in his chest, like a cat kneading its claws into a tender wound. When the procedure was done, Lucas packed the vials of Zlata's blood into his satchel. A deep exhaustion weighed on him, and a high-pitched ringing filled his head. Zlata, drained of energy, lay back on the bench. "Rest," Lucas instructed. He was about to leave when she whispered, "I'm scared." Her voice quivered. "I woke up this morning, and my hands were covered in blood." "I don't remember whose was it." Lucas froze in the doorway. So, Reynard hadn't done as he'd been told. Let it be an animal, Lucas thought, though he didn't believe it himself. Sure enough, as he stepped into the road, he saw a gathering of villagers. A woman in a brightly patterned scarf was wailing, while a boy, no older than 7, sobbed at her knees. Beyond them lay a man, flat on the ground. Something was wrong. His head was separated from his neck. On closer inspection, Lucas saw that the head was still attached, but the throat had been so savagely torn that the bloodied remnants were indistinguishable from the black earth beneath. But she didn't run, Lucas thought. That means there's still hope. The transformation isn't complete. As long as she can shift back and forth, I'll fight this cursed illness. She won't become a bride of the wolf, won't hunt innocents beneath the shadow of the pines. Reynard stood nearby, distant and withdrawn. Lucas approached him without hesitation, his voice sharp with reproach. "I told you to lock the door." "It was wolves from the forest," Reynard replied, shaking his head. "They've come before, but we drove them out months ago." "It must be their offspring." "Offspring," Lucas repeated silently. "Yes, offspring, but not of wolves, Reynard. Yours. Though who can say for certain now?" For 3 days Lucas continued his treatments, trembling each time he entered Zlata's room. He couldn't decide what frightened him more, the thought of finding her dead or discovering the room empty. Neither came to pass. On the 4th day, Zlata greeted him with a smile. "I'm feeling better, Lucas," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him as though he were her betrothed and not Conrad. "I stayed awake all night, and I remember every moment. The illness is retreating." Lucas ran his hand over her soft hair, down to the embroidered sash at her waist. She was beaming with joy, yet she seemed to have already forgotten the man she had killed. Or perhaps she didn't know, or didn't want to know. He couldn't bring himself to ask her. Instead, that evening, he sought out Reynard. "It was wolves," Reynard repeated firmly. "Everyone knows that." "Your daughter woke up with blood on her hands," Lucas reminded him. "What's she supposed to do with that?" "She imagined it," Reynard said stubbornly. "Tell me instead, how is the treatment progressing?" "It's nearly complete," Lucas replied. "Tonight, I'll stay with her to know for certain." "And what if it doesn't work?" Reynard asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Lucas hesitated, searching for the right words, his thoughts flashing back to the elder's daughter, long dead now. "Don't curse my name," he finally said, "and bury her properly." An hour before midnight, Lucas arrived at Zlata's room with a knife tucked into his belt. On the table, someone had left him a bowl of stew and a piece of bread, while a corner had been prepared with a blanket for him to rest. Conrad, upon hearing about the plan, had twisted his face into a grimace, but didn't argue with Reynard. He couldn't risk losing the elder's approval for his marriage to Zlata. "What's Lucas anyway?" Conrad had muttered to Reynard while Lucas stood outside, preparing to say his goodbyes. Skinny, pale, silent, and a fugitive. A girl like Zlata would never marry someone like him. Lucas had heard the words but didn't respond. As he walked to Zlata's room, his mind churned. Conrad is right, he thought. Only an orphan would settle for someone like me, and even then, I'd have to convince her. But who cares about marriage? It's enough to love and be loved in return. "Shall we play cards?" Zlata asked timidly, breaking into his thoughts. "I have nothing to bet with," Lucas replied, though in truth he wanted nothing more than to stay in her company, cards or not. "Then let's play for wishes," she suggested with a sly smile. He couldn't refuse. Zlata brought out a worn deck, its corners bent and backs faded from use. Lucas had only played once or twice before. He'd spent most of his days sitting in a cellar with Peresvet. Unsurprisingly, he lost quickly and without much resistance. "Looks like I win," Zlata said, delighted. "I'll do whatever you wish," Lucas promised. She stood and moved toward him, so light on her feet he barely noticed her approach until her arms wrapped around his neck. He didn't move, afraid that the slightest touch might make her crumble like ash from a burned letter. But she didn't crumble. Instead, she enveloped him in her warmth, slipping beneath his skin and embedding herself there forever. "You saved me," she whispered, her lips brushing his face like velvet petals falling from a marigold. "You saved me twice, once from the illness, and once from a loveless life with Conrad. Take me as your wife, Lucas. Let's run away from my father. He treats me like livestock. Don't go here. Listen only to him. Marry Conrad, a fine match. But I can't marry Conrad. I love you." Lucas accepted her offerings in silence, his thoughts consumed by what the morning would bring. But in the morning, she lay beside him, unchanged. Lucas realized that the illness truly had receded. It was time for him to leave. The nightingales sang in the forest. Lucas reached a stream and stopped to rest. His body burned, and a savage chill gripped him so fiercely that his hands couldn't form a fist. His mind flickered between clarity and shadow. Suddenly, his senses sharpened. He could distinguish every scent, sharper than a hunting dog. Under the spread of a pine tree, Lucas made himself a bed for the night. He doubted he would die, even if he continued to starve. By nightfall, the transformation would be complete. Then he would do what had to be done. A fever dragged him into a dead sleep. Through the haze, he heard the cawing of crows and the distant howl of wolves. It felt as if his bones were swelling and burning like charred logs in a fire. Sweat slicked his body, and his eyelids itched as if bitten by ants. He wanted to sink deeper into the void, but someone was calling to him from afar, their voice loud and drawn out. "Lucas, Dot." He raised his head, straining to listen. It wasn't his imagination. Someone was calling his name. Could it be Conrad, chasing after him to punish him for daring to love his bride? Lucas was ready to explain himself, but not now. Not when dusk had already spilled its black jelly over the pine crowns. Lucas, the familiar voice called again. A chill spread through Lucas. He recognized the melodic tone, like a bell's chime. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. He pressed himself to the ground, praying she would pass by. But Zlata emerged from the forest and saw him curled on the earth. "Lucas," she cried. He sprang up, gathering what strength he had, ready to flee. But the confusion on her face rooted him in place. "I know what you did," she said, her voice trembling. "Leave," Lucas answered sharply, unwilling to discuss what had already been decided. "Go now." "That wasn't Boar's blood," she sobbed, wiping tears from her chin. "It was your own." Lucas's gaze shifted to the dense raspberry thicket behind her. The twilight thickened, and the moon, shedding its gown of clouds, stood naked above the forest. "What have you done?" Zlata moaned, clutching her hands to her chest. "You've doomed yourself." "There was no other cure," Lucas spat. "Boar's blood doesn't fight the illness. Human blood is needed. And if I'd given you all of mine, there'd be no one left to finish the treatment. Besides, someone has to stop the beast." He stepped back, pressing his spine against the prickly bark of a tree, and tilted his head upward. His face burned and itched unbearably. His body convulsed, and then he heard the crack of his own bones. His skull flattened on the sides, his nose jutted forward, and his teeth lengthened, protruding past his lower lip. White fur erupted through his skin. His nails curled downward, his thumbs shrank, and his hands became coarse and claw-like. Lucas hunched over, his arms lengthening to match his legs, until he stood firmly on 4 limbs, his maw bristling with fangs. "Is this why you came here?" Zlata whispered, unmoving. "To avenge me?" Lucas shook his head. Not for her, but for the one he had failed to save. For the one who had died because he hadn't been strong enough. The beast in the forest had evaded hunters for years, lying in wait for a mate to answer its call, for pups to come. Every creature seeks its pair. But a man, Lucas realized, doesn't always need one. "But even if you defeat it," Zlata sobbed, her voice trembling, "where will you go next?" "My love, my dearest, take me with you. I've fallen for you more deeply than life itself. I'll be whatever you need, human or wolf, but don't leave me here alone." Lucas growled at her, a low, guttural sound meant to stop her. Why did she care where he was going? She had a different life waiting for her, a long, happy one. "Zlata," a voice called out from behind her. Conrad stepped into view at the stream's edge, his bowstring drawn so tight it seemed ready to snap. Zlata turned, startled, and threw up her hands, but it was too late. As soon as Conrad caught sight of the beast, he loosed his arrow without hesitation, trying to save his bride. Lucas leapt to the side, but the arrow buried itself deep into his stomach, igniting an explosion of fiery pain. Zlata ran to him, her movements frantic, slipping past Conrad before he could stop her. She threw herself onto Lucas, clutching fistfuls of his white fur, her face pressed into his soft pelt. "Forgive me," she wailed, her voice raw and wolf-like. "Forgive me." Lucas glanced at Conrad, who stood rigid, his gaze hard and unyielding. He heard her, Lucas realized. He heard her pleading for me, and he'd shot with purpose. Lucas struggled to his feet, his legs trembling. Blood matted the fur on his belly, but strength still pulsed through him. He touched Zlata's hand with his dry tongue, memorizing her taste as a final farewell. A healer cannot consider himself worthy until he makes a sacrifice, Parisvet the herbalist had once told him. But now Lucas remembered the words differently. A healer cannot consider himself worthy until he sacrifices himself. Slowly, Lucas trotted into the raspberry thicket, his fur snagging on the thorny branches. He pushed forward, away from the village, away from everything he had known, away from himself. Lucas moved farther and farther from the town. The wounds on his body ached, but it was a strange kind of pain. Nothing stirred in his chest. It was as though his very spirit had retreated, leaving him an empty shell. He felt as if he existed outside of himself, observing his body from a distance. His paws moved confidently over the earth, unafraid. He felt every root, every patch of damp moss beneath him, every gust of wind ruffling his fur. The world around him was alive with sounds, scents, and movements he'd never noticed before. He followed the river, avoiding open spaces. The forest became his home, his refuge. The beast within him stirred more strongly with each passing hour. Yet Lucas's mind held firm, clinging to his humanity. He remembered his duty. The beast that had cost him everything still roamed these woods. Food was a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. The faintest scent of prey was enough to guide him, his body instinctively propelling him into the hunt. Once, he might have spent hours tracking his quarry, relying on sight and logic. Now, he felt its presence even in places with no visible signs. A single leap was all it took to bring down his prey. Each night brought new changes. He felt his animal instincts growing stronger, pushing out the last remnants of his humanity. In the mirrored surface of the stream, he no longer recognized himself. His face had elongated, his gaze turned cold and predatory. The teeth that pierced his lips were a constant reminder of his transformation. Yet his soul clung to the last vestiges of his humanity, refusing to let go. On the fourth day, Lucas found his first true lead. In a clearing surrounded by tall grass, he spotted bloodstains leading deeper into the woods. The trail led him to a grove of ancient pines, their sprawling branches blotting out the sky. The air reeked of blood and decay. Lucas froze, lifting his head to sniff the air. The beast was near. Conflicting desires battled within him. The human part of him longed to destroy the threat, while the wolf within him hungered for prey, but the hunger could be sated elsewhere. The predator that haunted the forest, destroying everything in its path, could only be stopped one way. Lucas moved cautiously. He knew time was against him. The beast could flee or detect him first. But he also understood that this forest wasn't just a hunting ground for the monster. It was its home. If it left, it wouldn't stay away for long. The tall grass parted, revealing signs of the beast's presence. The earth was torn up, as if something massive had burrowed there. In the distance, a large animal skeleton lay picked clean. This was the beast's lair, its hunting ground, its resting place. Lucas crouched low, hiding in the dense underbrush. He couldn't be sure the beast was nearby, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake. As evening shadows deepened, Lucas realized the beast wasn't present. He could leave, continue searching, but he chose to stay. He concealed himself in the tall grass, watching the clearing. His wounds no longer bled but throbbed painfully. Movement drained him, leaving his limbs weak and trembling. He knew he couldn't wait long, but there was no other choice. Night fell swiftly. The forest came alive with sounds. The cries of night birds, the rustling of small animals, the rhythmic thud of hooves against tree roots. Lucas almost closed his eyes, but then he heard it. A faint crack. A cautious sound, betraying the presence of something large. He wasn't mistaken. From the darkness the beast emerged. It was enormous, its black fur thick and glossy. Its bulk rivaled that of a bear, yet its movements were as fluid and graceful as a wolf's. The creature stopped in the clearing, sniffing the air. Lucas knew it had sensed him. His heart stopped. He watched as the predator tensed, preparing to pounce. Lucas growled, rising onto his hind legs. He had to show he was ready to fight. The beast lunged. Everything happened in a fraction of a second, yet for Lucas, time slowed. He felt the beast's claws tear through his side, but he managed to clamp his jaws around its throat. The battle was savage. The beast was stronger, but Lucas knew his persistence and human intellect were his greatest weapons. Lucas continued deeper into the forest, avoiding trails and human tracks. The pain in his body was unrelenting, but he accepted it as part of his new nature. Each night brought him closer to understanding the changes within him. He was no longer human, but the creature inside him wasn't purely a wolf either. It was something else, an unsettling blend of instinct and reason that kept him from losing the last fragments of himself. By noon, Lucas reached a hill covered in tall grass. The place felt relatively safe, and he allowed himself to stop. The sun warmed his back, but he couldn't relax. He needed a plan, and for that, he needed time. Lucas examined the chain he had found in an abandoned campsite. It seemed sturdy, as though made for something important, but its purpose was a mystery. He figured it might come in handy if he encountered another beast like the one he had killed. At dawn, he moved on, relying on his heightened senses. The forest had transformed for him. It was no longer merely a source of danger. Now, every rustle, every scent carried information he could use. Lucas moved cautiously, avoiding open spaces. The forest punished carelessness. By nightfall, he found shelter under the exposed roots of a fallen tree. Sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, he saw the town he had left behind, the people he had abandoned. He thought of Zlata, her eyes brimming with both fear and hope. Why had she forgiven him? Why had she seen more in him than he saw in himself? These questions haunted him. On the third day, Lucas realized his goal was no longer just survival. He sensed a greater danger, one that had yet to fully reveal itself. The forest around him was eerily quiet. Even the birds had stopped singing, and small creatures hid in their burrows. Lucas stopped, sniffing the air. The scent was faint but unmistakable, not blood, but something akin to fear and death. He followed the scent until he came to a deep depression in the earth. Here lay the remains of animals, and among them, Lucas spotted human tracks. Heavy boots, large sizes. There were several people. Lucas understood he wasn't the only one aware of the beasts in these woods. Doubt gnawed at him. What would happen if he encountered humans again? Would they see him as one of their own, or would they turn their weapons on him, mistaking him for a monster? He knew their fear would outweigh their reason. Still, he had to find out who these people were and what they were doing deep in the forest. On the fourth day, Lucas saw smoke. He moved carefully, not wanting to draw attention to himself. The forest here was sparse, and he could be spotted from a distance. The smoke came from a fire, around which sat 3 men. They looked tired and wary. Rifles lay beside them, and around the camp were cages, from which came low growls. Lucas watched from the cover of the trees. He didn't need to get closer to understand what was inside the cages. The creatures were like the beast he had killed. One was smaller but aggressive, while the other lay motionless, as though resigned to its fate. These were no ordinary animals. Lucas could sense their intelligence, their pain, and their hatred. The men talked among themselves. Their words were muffled, but Lucas caught fragments. They mentioned a delivery, a specific location, and a price. One spoke of a city, while another discussed the payment they would receive. But the most important question remained unanswered. Why did they want these beasts? Lucas knew he couldn't intervene. The men were armed and he was alone. Yet he also knew that if these creatures reached their destination, the consequences could be catastrophic. Lucas decided he had to act, even if it cost him his life. That night, when the men fell asleep, Lucas crept closer. He moved silently, avoiding twigs and dry leaves. His goal was clear: free the creatures, not out of mercy, but because they couldn't be allowed to fall into human hands. He reached the cages while the men slept. The locks were simple, and he used the chain to pry them open. The creatures inside didn't understand at first. They eyed Lucas warily, but eventually one stepped out, sniffing the air. Lucas growled softly, signaling that he meant no harm. The second beast emerged, weak and unsteady. Lucas nudged it with his muzzle, helping it to stand. At that moment, one of the men woke up. His shout roused the others. They grabbed their rifles, but it was too late. The beasts lunged at them, and Lucas didn't intervene. He knew it was inevitable. When it was over, the camp was no more. The beasts disappeared into the forest, and Lucas was left alone among the remains of what had once been men. He felt no joy or satisfaction. He knew he had done the right thing, but the cost was too great. On the 5th day, Lucas retreated deeper into the forest. He understood that his place was here now. He was no longer part of the human world, but neither did the animal world fully accept him. He was something in between, a creature meant to protect the balance. He thought often of Zlata in those final days. What had become of her? Did she think of him? He hoped she was alive and well, that her life had continued without him. But he knew he could never return to her world. Lucas reached the clearing where he had fought the beast. The grass was trampled, the signs of their battle still visible. Here he decided to stay. This place had become a symbol of his new life and purpose. He lifted his head to the sky and closed his eyes. The forest was his home now. Here he found peace and meaning. Here he found himself.